Tsunami. December 2004. The world watched in horror as killer waves took 250,000 lives, assaulting more than a dozen countries and spanning the entire Indian Ocean.
The human toll was something that you see or think about in a movie, but you don't realize what it's going to look like in real life.
The devastation was unbelievable. But scientists say the same terror could hit our shores.
As far as tsunami goes in the United States, it may be the single greatest threat to life. It's an incredible danger.
Just off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, a 700-mile stretch of towns and beaches is in the bullseye of a mega tsunami.
The odds of another great earthquake and tsunami is about 8 times greater than the odds of dying from a car crash.
An American mega tsunami may be unthinkable, but it is inescapable.
What happened in the Indian Ocean will actually inevitably happen here.
A calm beach in the Pacific Northwest. Tall stands of fir trees sweep toward the roaring surf. A typical day in this beautiful, rugged region. But about 50 miles off the coast of Oregon, sometime in the future, an earthquake will be born. A giant undersea sheet of rock known as the Juan de Fuca tectonic plate has been sliding under the edge of North America for millennia, moving a few inches each year. Scientific models make clear that the heat and pressure will slowly increase. From everything science knows about this volatile spot, someday it will rupture explosively.
Pressure builds up for years, for centuries, finally breaks. The breaking is a huge earthquake. It moves the ocean bottom.
On a nearby Oregon beach, the earth will buckle and the forest will rock. With a force equal to more than 20,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs, the fault rupture will shoot massive pulses of water both east and west across the Pacific Ocean. Undersea, billions of tons of water will heave violently as the fault rips northward swiftly along its 700-mile length. These pulses of water will fill the ocean's water column from the bottom to the surface and pitch up at the shoreline and become giant waves. They'll roar into small towns, uprooting and destroying everything in their path. Trees, cars, concrete, houses. Waves of water and huge deadly chunks of debris rushing inland up to several miles will assault the shoreline from northern California to southern British Columbia. Moving at 30 miles an hour, tsunami waves will outrace anyone on foot. These killer waves won't stop until they collide with a mountain or other obstacle. The massive inundation and savage pummeling of debris will affect 500,000 Americans. Thousands will be killed. Damage will be tallied in the tens of billions of dollars. This doomsday scenario, a 700-mile-long American mega tsunami originating from an area geologists call the Cascadia Subduction Zone, has haunted seismologists for years.
Cascadia is ready. The rubber band, so to speak, is stretched. It's ready to snap.
The Cascadia Subduction Zone is dangerous because it has very large earthquakes that occur fairly frequently in time. About every 300 or 400 years, you have a big earthquake there. The last one was 300 years ago.
But after the devastating tsunami in the Indian Ocean in 2004, what seemed remote now feels inevitable.
Since the Indian Ocean tsunamis, it's a big wake-up call for all of the towns along the Pacific Northwest.
Now, cities along the coastline are deploying sophisticated battle plans to try to save themselves from destruction. But many in the region are on edge. knowing the catastrophe could strike at any time, and that a mega tsunami's ferocity and power could easily outmatch their readiness plans.
I like to think of it as the ocean turning into a river. It's basically a giant grabs the seafloor, lifts the seafloor up, and all the water slides inland and just basically drowns what's ever there. So it's not a big Hollywood splash. It comes in, it's more of a flood, a high-speed flood.
This rare footage taken from a submarine floating over Cascadia's fault line shows an eerie and deceptively quiet place.
So there's just like little channels running down the side of this.
It hides a seismic fault brewing several miles beneath. But when this sleeping monster finally awakens, which it will do, thousands will be in peril. Subduction zones, where two huge tectonic plates grind against each other, create the biggest earthquakes on the planet, unleashing pent-up energy in violent fashion. Big subduction zone quakes tend to impact huge areas and are usually more powerful and deeper in the earth than most land-based quakes. Scientists have no precise way to measure how much pressure Cascadia and other subduction zones are building up, or when they will strike. What terrifies scientists and emergency planners most is that a Cascadia eruption may actually create a double catastrophe. First, the earthquake will destabilize the ground and wreak havoc with evacuation plans. Then, the tsunami will devour what is left of the landscape.
You have no control over Mother Nature, let's face it. Pay heed, drastically pay heed.
This is the nightmare that devastated the Indian Ocean in 2004. It can, and someday will, happen here.
We're almost certain that the Cascadia earthquake will make tsunamis because all the past ones made tsunamis. If you have a big earthquake that happens under the ocean, you're going to uplift the seafloor or downdrop the seafloor. That's going to disturb the surface of the water, and you're going to make tsunami waves to propagate out. It happened before, and it will happen the next time, too.
Scientists say the Pacific Northwest coast is marked for eventual disaster. The coast has a volatile earthquake fault just off its shore, known as the Cascadia subduction zone, that is brewing a cauldron of heat and violent pressures. The fault will, at some point in the future, discharge its colossal energy in a supersized earthquake and tsunami. In 2004, the world got a terrifying glimpse of this future. On December 26th, just before 8 o'clock in the morning, the ground begins to shake violently here in Indonesia. It shakes not just for a few seconds, but for up to 10 minutes in some places. It is a Sunday, the day when families gather. And on this day, families cling to each other for dear life. Indonesia is struck by frequent earthquakes, but this one is unusually violent. The Sumatran subduction zone rips for some 100 miles wide and more than 700 miles long, about the same size and shape as the Cascadia subduction zone off the U.S. West Coast. The quake is so strong that it jostles the Earth's very axis from its rotation. Locals in the Banda Aceh region of Sumatra are horrified, but have no idea a much bigger threat is already heading their way. From Indonesia to Thailand, waters recede from the shore, drawing unknowing victims into a rushing deluge that will reach 4 stories high in parts of Banda Aceh.
Oh, tsunami! My God, it's
a mega tsunami is tearing across the Indian Ocean as fast as a jet plane at 500 miles an hour.
Get in!
That earthquake displaced the seafloor and caused the seawater above it to be disturbed, and that then began propagating as a very long wave across the Indian Ocean. The first waves began affecting the west coast of Sumatra within some 10 to 15 minutes.
At the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Honolulu, staffers scramble into overdrive. They try to make sense of something happening on a scale far beyond what they have ever seen. Their estimates of the quake force rapidly rise, from an 8 to a 9.0, meaning a tenfold increase in intensity. It's one of the strongest quakes in history.
What most surprised me about the Sumatra earthquake was 4 hours after it occurred, when we realized it wasn't just a locally or regionally damaging event, but was ocean-wide.
And most ominously, the quake is shallow. Earthquakes that start deep in the earth are muted by its crust and weaken by the time they reach land. But a shallow earthquake means more power and a more powerful tsunami. From Sumatra, the massive tsunami rages across the Indian Ocean, north to Thailand. A little more than an hour later, it turns upscale beach hotels into rivers of debris. And towers of screaming and death. An hour after that, the waves attack Sri Lanka, flipping trains and turning buses and cars into deadly weapons against a stunned public. The island of Sri Lanka experiences a wraparound effect, where the waves bend around the island, causing destruction all along the far western coastline. The terrible waves then roar across the Pacific and reach all the way to Africa some 7 hours later, tossing boats like toys and clobbering coastal villages. The waves roll on for more than 12 hours, striking more than a dozen countries and hurtling destruction more than 5,000 miles.
I've never seen anything that was just as big over as big an area and affecting as many places as this one event.
Places nearest to the earthquake's epicenter off Sumatra take the hardest hit. In nearby Banda Aceh, it looks like a nuclear bomb has struck. The ocean and forest disgorge bodies for weeks afterwards. These before and after satellite images further punctuate the degree of destruction. One can see that the once lush green vegetation has been stripped bare. All that remains is a muddy brown covering. In Khao Lak, Thailand, an hour from ground zero, the same is true. Even veteran tsunami watchers were shocked.
Being in Banda Aceh and the wave penetrating, several kilometers inland and actually just inundating an entire city was something that you see or think about in a movie, but you don't ever realize what it's going to look like in real life.
The death toll is staggering. 200,000 killed in Indonesia alone. The carnage cuts a wide swath. Vacationers in Thailand, fishermen in Sri Lanka, shopkeepers in Indonesia. Waters reached 4 miles inland at some points, and no one, save for the very lucky few, is spared.
The wave set the oceans of the world all in motion from this single event. And it was indeed a global tsunami.
When geologists studied the killer Indian Ocean tsunami, they were struck by its uncanny similarities to America's own vulnerable coast.
As far as tsunami goes in the United States, it may be the single greatest threat to life and limb, because it's potentially a Sumatra type up to a magnitude 9 event on a huge subduction zone off the northwest coast. It's an incredible danger.
Both Cascadia and the subduction zone that created the Sumatra tsunami lie along the so-called Ring of Fire. The ring rims much of the Pacific's shorelines, marking where tectonic plates grind against each other to create the world's largest earthquakes.
There are, in fact, very haunting similarities between the December 26 tsunami and our own Cascadia subduction zone. What happened in the Indian Ocean will actually inevitably happen here.
Seismologists have solid reasons to believe a mega tsunami will strike the U.S. West Coast. The evidence that it already has struck before lies in these forests. Evidence that may write out a death sentence for thousands of men, women, and children. The Pacific Northwest is in mortal danger. 700 miles of coastline is in the direct path of a massive tsunami. There's no way to predict when this will happen. But geologists like this man, Oregon State University's Chris Goldfinger, are hunting deep into history for clues about how it may unfold. Goldfinger is in a race to unravel the geological secrets of this region, known as Cascadia, before it's too late. He collects dirt core samples pulled directly from the seafloor there and stores them in this ultra-cold freezer. The samples reveal a story 10,000 years in the making.
These cores are essentially tape recorders that record everything that happens in the deep sea, but the biggest thing that happens is great earthquakes.
Tsunamis and big earthquakes leave these clearly marked layers in the cores.
And it's much bigger than the 1700 earthquake, so that makes me wonder if...
Showing where they dumped gray sand deposits that stand in sharp contrast to the brown mud around them.
I can see a little bit of a color change right up maybe here.
To Goldfinger, the cores going back 10,000 years are a roadmap of Cascadia's violent seismic past and future.
For the last 10,000, we see a total of 23 large earthquakes that would generate tsunamis, and about 2/3 of those ruptured the full length of Cascadia, we think. So they'd be much like the 2004 earthquake in Sumatra and generate very large tsunamis.
Goldfinger's dirt samples reveal unmistakable evidence about how often and how violently Cascadia erupts.
Hard to get around that this event is so big everywhere we look.
Right.
He believes that the thicker the grayish bands of sea dirt, the bigger the quake that deposited them there. The core samples also indicate how many years separate the different tsunamis, a timetable of impending devastation.
The average repeat time is about 520, but we've had probably 4 or 5 that were 100 to 150 years apart. So we can really have one any time. There's no known way yet to predict when that's going to be, but it could be tomorrow or it could be 50 years from now.
Geologist Brian Atwater is also studying the soils of the Pacific Northwest. Atwater is chasing down evidence that may help solve a 300-year-old tsunami mystery, with terrifying implications. Written records tell of a mysterious tsunami that struck Japan on January 26, 1700. But strangely, no one felt any earthquake. How could a tsunami be created without an earthquake? Atwater found the answer in the remote marshlands here in Puget Sound, Washington State.
Sand layers like this are part of the evidence for a very big earthquake and tsunami here about 300 years ago. And geologists learned about that in the late 1980s, early 1990s. By the early 90s, we were able to say that a very big earthquake and tsunami, or a series of them, happened between 1680 and 1720.
Atwater believed that this tsunami on the coast of the Pacific Northwest was the same one that had struck Japan in 1700. To find out, Atwater hunted through pockets of remote Pacific Northwest forests filled with dead trees, so-called ghost forests.
We went to trees that the earthquake had killed by lowering the landscape, these ghost forests. And we asked those trees, did you really die in 1700?
You had nice samples up here.
Tree rings are a kind of fingerprint of the tree's history. Every year, a new ring of growth is added to a tree's trunk and branches just beneath the bark. By counting the number of rings, a scientist can determine the approximate age of a tree, or when it died. The tree rings indicated that the trees had died in 1700. Then, core barrels of dirt from the same areas revealed that a tsunami had struck that same year. Atwater had found a match. He concluded that the same catastrophe that killed the trees managed to span the globe and crashed into Japan, 4,500 miles away.
To have that sort of puzzle solved 300 years later is a remarkable feeling.
This data may write out a death sentence for the Pacific Northwest. The 1700 tsunami created waves at least 30 to 40 feet high. What would happen if a similar tsunami were to occur today?
The odds of another great earthquake and tsunami here at Cascadia is about 8 times greater than the odds of the average person in the United States dying from a car crash.
The ocean is a tsunami factory.
Every day there's magnitude 6 somewhere in the oceans, and it's going to make a tsunami, it's a baby tsunami, I call it, just an inch or two high. So if you've been at the beach on the coast somewhere, you've probably been in a tsunami and didn't even know it.
But killer tsunamis require earthquakes more powerful than 7.5. And such large quakes happen on average only about once a year. Underwater landslides and even asteroid impacts can create tsunamis as well. Thankfully, these are rare occurrences. But earthquakes are much more likely. And core samples taken in Cascadia suggest that there is just one kind of locally produced variety: massive. These wide discolored bands of dirt are evidence of massive quakes. But amazingly, there is no evidence of much activity at all in the years separating these giant quakes. In other words, Cascadia seems to save up its energy just for mega eruptions.
The marine sediment record, as far back in time as you want to go, seems to show the same thing, that we just don't see small events.
Not just in Cascadia, the Earth is dotted with potentially dangerous subduction zones. On March 27, 1964, a subduction quake struck off the coast of Alaska. The quake devastated Anchorage and shook 500,000 surrounding square miles. It lasted for an incredible 3 to 5 minutes and was felt as far away as Cuba and Puerto Rico. It was the biggest recorded earthquake in North America. And then, the tsunami struck, with some waves reaching 200 feet. All told, 125 people were killed. Waves rolled all the way down the Pacific, a 1,500-mile journey that brought death to Crescent City, California. Survivor Gary Clausen was at a bar celebrating his father's 54th birthday when the waves crashed right into the building.
The building just crumbled like been in a beer can right in the middle, and it left its foundation. There was propane tanks and trailer houses and the awfulest array of stuff coming and floating around in that water.
He looked everywhere for his parents and girlfriend, who had been washed out of the bar just as he was. After searching for 5 hours, rescuers found their bodies. They were 3 of the town's 11 fatalities.
Most of the folks on the West Coast here that wasn't affiliated with that, still they don't realize how devastating and how strong. You just don't mess with that ocean.
Crescent City was an easy target. Fortunately, the Pacific Northwest's biggest city, Seattle, was out of range this time. But the area's 4 million residents may not be so lucky in the future. Seattle sits atop another network of extremely active earthquake faults. In 2001, these faults erupted in a 6.8 quake, rattling buildings and nerves. But warnings of a future catastrophe lie hidden in Seattle's geography. For example, Brian Atwater has found these unusual land rises in Puget Sound, just a few miles from the city. He believes that they were caused by a huge underwater quake, landslide, and tsunami 1,100 years ago. Seattle is long overdue for an encore performance. Here, scientists and emergency planners are studying damage patterns to buildings and bridges from past quakes and tsunamis in the area. One such incident occurred about a century ago in Puget Sound. Today, much of the region's infrastructure could not withstand either catastrophic quakes or mega tsunamis. Thousands of Seattle homes and buildings are made of unreinforced masonry, and its spectacular but seismically treacherous aerial highways are pathways to catastrophe. In addition, much of its infrastructure is built on landfill and silt, which can liquefy in a quake and enhance violent ground shaking.
Okay, Chris, go ahead.
At Oregon State University, Dan Cox is helping to design a better city, one that might actually stand up against a mega disaster. Cox manages to create the impossible at will, exact recreations of killer tsunamis.
Chris, are you ready?
This facility is the largest of its kind in the world.
The ultimate goal of the research here is to save lives in the event of a tsunami, and primarily through safer infrastructure, and that means stronger bridges and buildings that could withstand a tsunami, and to help with questions like debris flow and where will the debris go, and how can we plan our evacuation scenarios more effectively.
Giant motors generating thousands of pounds of force push these 29 huge paddles. The paddle's speed and power determine how big a wave is shot across the 160-foot pool. Each wave simulates the power of a wave 50 times its height. A 2-foot wave in the tank will simulate the damage of a 100-foot wave on the coast. Teams of researchers from all over the world work on scale models of towns to study what a tsunami will do to them. For instance, how a tsunami would affect a city on the Oregon coast.
The researchers that come here, what they're doing is looking at things like what's the impact of a tsunami on a liquefied natural gas container. And so that helps us to come up with better designs for the thickness of the container and how to keep major disasters from happening when tsunami reaches a port, for example. What we're finding now is we really aren't prepared for building the next generation of bridges and structures. The Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004 really woke the community up. We really need to rethink how we design our buildings to withstand tsunamis on the coast.
Dan Cox and his team are in a race to prevent a catastrophe. Millions of people are living in a potential disaster zone. Fatalities could number in the thousands unless something is done, and done soon. Someday, a catastrophic Pacific Northwest earthquake and tsunami will pound hundreds of miles of shoreline and devour dozens of popular coastal towns. One town in the tsunami's firing line is Seaside, Oregon, a picture postcard village of 6,500 that sits on a vast beach, nestled under the towering coastal range. But its beauty is nearly matched by its vulnerability. Seaside is only about 20 feet above sea level. The tsunami-friendly Pacific Northwest geography puts the whole coast at risk. Few recognize the dangers more acutely than this man, geologist Tom Horning.
Seaside does live on borrowed time. There have been probably 8 earthquakes, 8 tsunamis, and they've all probably gone over the town. So it's a good indicator of what the future holds for us. One of these days we'll have another one.
To try to raise awareness of his town's precarious situation, Horning organizes events such as this one at Seaside High School.
This is so important because you're right next to the ocean, and this school may very well be wrecked totally by a big earthquake and tsunami. When these things come in, they are not just waves, they are plateaus of water that are up to a mile across, doing 25 or 30 miles an hour. And they'll pull you under and drown you just like that.
Horning tells his story from harsh personal experience. As a boy growing up in Seaside, he survived a horrific tsunami, the same that struck Crescent City in 1964. It flooded his property and forever imprinted in him fear about the ocean and tsunami dangers.
Over in my neck of the woods, which is north of here, just north of the fitness center, the water was about 3 to 4 feet deep, took away the car, the fences, the dock, the chicken coop, the rabbit hutch, swept away Whitey the cat, Never saw him again.
Horning has created maps of the town that show how far, based on computer models, a tsunami will reach into Seaside. His maps also show how many minutes warning after feeling the earthquake that people will have to head uphill to safety from the tsunami waters. Everywhere he looks in Seaside, Horning sees potential very serious hazards. One such hazard surrounds the local fire department.
It's very likely that this brick building will collapse. Either the bell tower will come down and fall on the main part of the building, or the whole thing will come down. If it falls down, it'll bury the fire department, fire engines, and emergency response vehicles. Those are the kind of resources you need after the tsunami and after the earthquake to get around and rescue people.
A walking tour of Seaside is a voyage of impending catastrophe.
The two bridges behind me are the Broadway Bridge, which is the closer one, and the Avenue A Bridge, which is the one behind me. Both of these bridges are probably not seismically sound. So when we have the big earthquake, the Broadway Bridge will certainly collapse, and the Avenue A Bridge down below, it'll probably fall apart too.
And of the 11 bridges in Seaside, Horning says at least 7 of them will tumble like toys in a big quake and tsunami, trapping those people trying to escape. The 1700 Pacific Northwest mega tsunami that geologist Brian Atwater studied also left its deadly mark here. In Seaside, this catastrophe tore away the land, creating a channel that is still visible.
The tsunami channel tells us that we have high velocity, very deep water that moves through here from a tsunami that comes through. It gives us a parameter to gauge the future tsunamis. If it could do it in the past, it can do it in the future. It's a very significant hazard. I think it's pretty scary, actually, in some ways.
As bad as this disaster might be, it will be much worse if it strikes in the wrong month. During the summer, the population of Seaside swells to 50,000 with an influx of tourists. A frightening concept for a small town crisscrossed by 2-lane roads that would quickly clog up during a tsunami evacuation. And dozens of towns like Seaside dot the Pacific Northwest coast, from logging and fishing towns to upscale resorts, historic sites, lighthouses, and out-of-the-way hamlets. Many of them are bigger than Seaside, and all of them are jammed with tourists in the summertime, bringing the total summer population in the area to about 500,000. Other communities are full 12 months out of the year. Oregon's booming metropolis, Portland, is just about 60 miles up the mighty Columbia River.
Tsunamis propagate on water, and the more water you have, the easier it is for the tsunami to propagate. So that a certain distance upriver, the coastal communities that are on the river banks are also at risk.
Most emergency planners think Portland is far enough inland to be fairly safe, but other small and medium-sized towns, such as low-lying historic Astoria, are right in the tsunami's bullseye. Here at the Coast Guard's Astoria Air Station at the mouth of the Columbia, Lieutenant David Feeney and his fellow chopper pilots are ready 24/7 to make rescues in case of a tsunami.
A couple of those neighborhoods are going to be underwater, and some of them are going to be surrounded by water. The first couple blocks in Astoria are extremely at risk. All the businesses and homes that are along the river will have flooding, and anything that's on a pier, like the old canneries, which a couple of them have been converted into hotels, those are at extreme risk in getting knocked down during a tsunami.
But the scale of the quake and tsunami catastrophe would easily overwhelm his station's capabilities. Any lead time would help keep the death toll down. To give Pacific Northwest residents that alert, the U.S. government operates a sophisticated system of warning stations around the Pacific, in Hawaii, Alaska, and in Seattle. Buoys like this one are part of a network of tsunami sensors known as DART, for Deep Ocean Assessment and Reporting of Tsunamis. DART is made up of specialized pressure sensors lying on the Pacific Ocean seafloor that detect tsunamis traveling overhead like a kind of tripwire. When the sensors detect a tsunami wave, the information is relayed via the buoys on the surface-to-land-based warning centers. Chris Meinig is an engineer for the DART system.
This part sits on the seafloor up to depths of 6,000 meters deep. A wave would come over it. It triggers a sensor that's located in here. It sends a signal to a computer that commands the acoustic modem to send a signal up to the buoy. And this can all happen in less than a minute. The buoy receives it at its modem. It sends an acknowledgement of the message that says, hey, there's alarm going on here, decodes it, then sends it up to a real-time satellite to a waiting person at a tsunami warning center that can do something with that message.
At the tsunami warning centers, researchers can compare data against computer models and get an instant picture to use in their forecasts to the public. The state-of-the-art DART buoy system can increase warning times, but a Cascadia tsunami could strike some parts of the shore in just 5 minutes.
The hope is even minutes in a message can make a difference. If you look what happened in Indonesia, if people just have a few minutes to get to higher ground, we can certainly save lives. So that's the #1 purpose, is to save lives, but then also it's for future wave events that might come, because it's not just going to be one big wave that's going to arrive.
The DART warning system had a real-life test on June 14, 2005, when the region was struck by a 7.2 magnitude earthquake, about 85 miles off northern California. The DART sensors detected tsunami waves, and the warning centers issued evacuation orders for parts of the West Coast, from Washington all the way to Southern California.
There was a rare occurrence on the West Coast last night. A tsunami alert was issued from California to Canada.
Fortunately, the tsunami was small, only a few inches high. This was because the earthquake moved up and down, not across the ocean like subduction zone quakes. The good news was that the warnings were issued in a timely manner. The bad news, the evacuations were haphazard and poorly organized, and the whole episode was sobering for many.
If it's a false alarm, people lose confidence. And the next time, which might be a big one, you're going to lose people because they do not evacuate.
Although the Pacific Northwest lives under a potential death sentence, many residents have chosen to ignore it. Not in Japan. There, huge seawalls and evacuation towers are built all along the coastline. Japanese school children are drilled to flee receding waters when big tsunamis pull the ocean back and shorelines retreat before they return in the form of huge waves. American classrooms have different lesson plans, and as a result, children may fail the ultimate test of life and death. In order to prepare for a mega disaster, we need to experience it. Now, using state-of-the-art computer graphics and special effects, we will get a first-hand look at a Pacific Northwest mega tsunami. The Pacific Northwest coast is a forest dotted with idyllic towns and ocean views. But the entire coastline, from northern California to southern British Columbia, with its 500,000 residents, is only moments away from a mega disaster. Labor Day weekend, the near future. Tens of thousands of people throng the beaches for one last hurrah before summer's end. Suddenly, about 60 miles offshore, the Cascadia subduction zone, after centuries of slumber, unleashes a giant 9.0 earthquake. The DART tsunami warning system sounds an alarm, and the 3 Pacific tsunami warning centers notify the whole region. But the warning system was set up for tsunamis that take many minutes, even hours, to arrive on shore. Cascadia's fault is at places just 30 miles and a few minutes from shore.
For distant tsunamis, it will work. For local tsunamis, it was never designed to be a warning system for local tsunamis. You cannot warn people in 15 minutes to get out of the way.
Within moments, the shoreline begins to shake. Beachgoers try and run for cover. For seconds and then minutes, the earth trembles violently.
It'll be hard to stand. You'll hear power lines coming down. You'll hear breaking glass, the thumping and screeching of metal. The bridges will probably be grinding and making noise. When the shaking is all over, you hear the inevitable screams and crying and confusion, and people that are starting to say, time to evacuate.
All at once, the ocean pulls back from shore. Some children who have not been taught their lessons in disaster head for the waterline, mesmerized by the sight of waves running backwards. The town's tsunami sirens wail and radios and TVs crackle with news of an approaching tsunami. But the warnings are too late. Moments later, the ocean seems to surge upward and charge toward the shore. Billions of tons of water pressure smash against the coast and its residents.
The ocean's going to rise up and wash in, and it's going to come in about 20, 30 miles an hour. So it's going to be a very fast raging river, basically. And anything that wasn't damaged by the earthquake will probably be swept away.
Like dozens of other communities along the coast, the town of Seaside, Oregon is directly in the path of the onslaught. Panicked residents and tourists flee as walls of water blast through town. The water roars up Broadway, submerging gift shops and hotels, and fills its leafy residential streets.
We think that the wave itself will be about 25 feet on the coast of Oregon. How much damage that does depends on what the shoreline is like. If the shoreline is very flat and open beaches, the wave will run in many miles. If there's a bluff there or some steep hills, most of the energy will hit the hill and reflect it back into the ocean.
People try to escape by foot and by car. Chaos and fear slow progress. But what is worse is that no one knows if or when another wave will strike. Big tsunamis move in wave trains, sometimes 4 or 5 or even more over several hours. The latter waves might be even more ferocious than the first ones. The flat terrain will do nothing to slow or stop the waves.
Without any high areas in the middle of town, there is no place to go. A couple of dunes maybe get up to 30 feet in a couple of spots. Whether that's high enough, I don't know.
The emergency services teams here, just an 18-person police force, and a small paramedic squad are immediately overwhelmed. Providence Hospital, the only one for 15 miles, is engulfed by water. Signs on almost every road in town point to the fastest route to safety in a tsunami. But with bridges out and panic in the streets, it's impossible to predict how useful the signs will be. To many, the combination of raging current and debris will simply prove overpowering.
Tsunamis, when they come in, they pick up sand and trees and logs and Volkswagens, and it's more like concrete than water. You get so much things to smack on you that you can't swim. You can basically beat to death.
For 700 miles up and down the coast, dozens of other resorts and fishing towns are swamped. Thousands are dead in Seaside as waves rip through its streets and flood its rivers. 50 miles south in Newport and 15 miles north in Astoria, the onslaught continues. These towns of 10,000 people each will likely lose thousands. The wave will then finger its way up to Canada and all the way down to Northern California, threatening some 500,000 people. The damage from both the quake and tsunami will be in the tens of billions of dollars.
The scenarios are that we're going to be a third world country again.
This American West Coast tsunami will likely spread worldwide across the Pacific, reaching Siberia, hitting Japan, and bearing south all the way down to New Zealand. Tsunami waves lose very little of the energy across the open ocean and won't stop until they hit a huge landmass. The scenario is as terrifying as preparing for it is daunting. The towns in the Pacific Northwest are scrambling for ways to steel themselves for disaster. On the drawing board now for West Coast tsunami planners is improving so-called vertical evacuation to high-rise buildings or hotels in coastal towns. Scientists are trying to improve warning systems by using new satellites that can detect subtle ocean lift caused by tsunamis. But in the meantime, common sense may be our best and perhaps only solution.
You can definitely make your situation better even in as little as 10 minutes. You just have to know what to do and not wait for someone to tell you to do it.